The Harlem Hellfighters was a regiment of New York National Guardsmen in the First World War. They were set up to fail by their own government. They were humiliated, degraded, eventually given to the French army as a throwaway, and they ended up coming home as one of the most decorated units in the entire U.S. Army.
The Harlem Hellfighters are one of the most important regiments in American history. In World War I, they helped to establish to the entire world the power of black soldiers in the military.
It was very difficult at that time for African Americans to get into the United States military because there was this perception that African Americans would not do well in battle. They had to overcome the prejudice of their own countrymen and yet also perform ably on the battlefield.
Like so many units of African American descent, when they go overseas, they're not sure what they're going to do. Are they going to fight as infantry? Or are they going to be stevedores and load ships? Or are they going to be labor units and cut wood?
And so they're committed to labor duty, they're unloading ships, building latrines, those type of support services. And as you can imagine, these men have been trained and they're willing to fight, they're ready to fight, and this is stressful for them.
They were finally given to the French army, which in a way was an even greater insult because in the First World War, when the United States entered, General Pershing, the commanding officer, was very clear that American forces would not be fed piecemeal into the French and British army because the French and British wanted reinforcements, and Pershing said absolutely not. When Americans join this war, they will fight as an American force under an American flag led by an American general. ... except for the black guys. You can have them.
Henry Johnson is perhaps one of the most remarkable black military heroes in U.S. history.
And he found himself in no man's land with Private Needham Roberts manning a listening post.
And Needham Roberts hears click, click, click. And he realizes somebody's cutting the wire. It's potentially a German raid.
And so Roberts is passing him grenades, and they line up these grenades, and the Germans actually do come across the lines. Roberts is hurt, and now Henry Johnson is left to defend their position and to stave off this attack. And then he makes the mistake of jamming a French cartridge into his American gun, and it no longer will work. And the Germans are on top of it.
He then used his rifle like a club, and then he ended up fighting with a knife against the Kaiser's best and turned them.
He's wounded in the fray. He's struck, for example, in the foot, and has a debilitating injury as a result. And he fights them off, he says, for what seemed like an hour.
The Germans ran shrieking into the night, all because of one man.
It's not until the next morning that people realize what a tremendous act this was. They discover 4 bodies of dead German soldiers. And they also realize from the equipment and other things that are left behind that as many as 30 may have been involved in this altercation.
As soon as he drove off those Germans, the French awarded him with the Croix de Guerre, a great honor. Unfortunately, it took about 75 years for the US government to give him the Legion of Merit. Had he been white, he would have walked out of that war with the Medal of Honor. What was so shocking to me when I began to research the story of the Hellfighters was that after they had performed so magnificently in combat, the United States government actually sent a memorandum to the French government, essentially implementing Jim Crow. Essentially saying, don't give them some notion that they are equals because we don't want them taking that notion back to the United States and demanding equality.
When they come back to the United States, he's not awarded the Purple Heart. There's no notation in his military record of his injury. And so he winds up not being able to work because of this injury. He doesn't get any kind of assistance from the Army or from the government as a result. And he ends up dying in 1929 penniless. So it again shows the paradox. Here's this great story of valor and of courage on the part of this soldier, and ultimately he comes back to a nation that doesn't honor that sacrifice.
We tend to think we all know American history so well, but the story of the Harlem Hellfighters should be one of the first stories told. It wasn't about killing other people, it was about being Americans and serving their country well. That was the inclination of the Harlem Hellfighters.
When you are African American in 1917, democracy is armor. Democracy is a weapon. And to fight for a war to make the world safe for democracy was something more than just some ethereal crusade for the Hellfighters. It had concrete results. They were fighting for the rights to be a citizen of the country that they were born in.
World War I leads to World War II as day follows night. By the end of World War I, everybody is looking to get advantage.
World War I didn't really end in 1918. It brutalized an entire generation of Europeans. It brutalized an entire generation of people around the world. And it made them realize that war on this scale was not only possible, but actually thinkable.
There's a wonderful, wonderful political cartoon where the fat politicians and generals are walking out of Versailles, and there's a little tiny boy, and he's crying in the corner. And I'm not kidding, he says, "I'm cannon fodder for 1940. They knew, anyone with half a brain knew that the Treaty of Versailles was essentially the starting gun for the Second World War.
Essentially what happened is that you create such an unstable economy and so much animosity between nations that you're just seeding the field of war to rise and grow again.
A lot of the anger, animosity, resentment that fuels the rise of the National Socialists of Adolf Hitler in Germany can be directly tied to that. It would be difficult to argue that that's simply propaganda that's utilized by Adolf Hitler. These were very difficult terms for the German people to handle. And it creates this bunker mentality, this us against the world mentality that ultimately will play out in Hitler being able to create a program that appeals to that sentiment.
To the average German, they have been sold out by the politicians.
In particular, it made people like Adolf Hitler, who had fought, after all, in the German army in World War I, think that if only the Germans could do it again, but do it right this time, they could actually win.
We call it World War I, World War II, but it's really two different stages of one global conflict. Just happens that people put their arms down for a 20-year period, and then they went back to fighting again.
The Germans are retreating. Adolf Hitler's been injured. And he has this encounter with Private Henry Tandy, a British private. Tandy has Adolf Hitler in his sights. And even though he's a trained soldier, he can't bring himself to pull the trigger. If Tandy had pulled the trigger, Adolf Hitler would have died on the battlefields in World War I, and the whole course of human history would have been changed. It's one of the great what-ifs in history.
One distant chapter in our nation's long history suddenly acquired renewed interest this year. Just over 100 years ago, the Spanish flu pandemic raged across the United States and around the world. Many of the strategies used to deal with it are the same ones we're using today. Elizabeth Palmer has more.
In 1918, World War I was finally ending. Millions were on the move, soldiers, refugees, and immigrants, all helping to spread the so-called Spanish flu.
It infected 1 in 3 people on Earth.
Laura Spinney is the author of Pale Rider.
And it killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people, which equates to 2.5 to 5% of the global population at that time.
COVID-19 attacks the lungs. So did the Spanish flu. Then, as now, there was no cure and no vaccine, just common sense prescriptions like fresh air. These women employees of Britain's War Department were sent on regular walks to ward off the virus. In San Francisco, even courtrooms moved outside. And anti-COVID masks in 2020 aren't much different from the ones people wore a century ago. But 1918 was different from 2020 in one crucial way. Ordinary people weren't told very much.
Why were the authorities censoring information about the outbreak?
The idea that you couldn't trust the public with too much information because they would panic and run riot, and then you wouldn't be able to control them.
So people blindly followed rules that killed them, especially soldiers on crowded troop ships who spread the virus around the world. It wasn't until 1920 that the worst pandemic in history ended, as COVID-19 will do too.
Eventually, it will just fizzle out. But the question is, how long will that take, and how many people are going to fall ill and die in the meantime?
The lesson of 1918 is social distancing and good hygiene do work. The future is up to us. For CBS This Morning, Saturday, I'm Elizabeth Palmer in London.
Back to basics, and so many times, Jeff, we've been saying this in so many ways, but if you don't learn from the past, you will repeat it. Obviously, a loose quote of that.
Yeah, imagine that common sense working 100 years ago, working today, and working 100 years from now. Not too complicated. Dana, thank you very much.
But as negotiations get underway, Wilson quickly realizes that each country has come to the table with their own agenda.
There were these national leaders who had different views of what they wanted out of the Paris Peace Conference. They had led their countries through this brutal, bloody, long war, and Wilson waltzes in with the Americans just at the end. So they had to listen to him, and Wilson could be kind of persuasive, but not that persuasive.
As negotiations drag on for months, the talks fall apart. And one allied nation feels completely cut out of the negotiations. Japan entered the war in 1914, contributing thousands of troops and millions of dollars to the war effort. They come to Versailles with one goal: to be treated equally. But Allied leaders completely ignore Japan throughout the proceedings. And for Japan, it's the ultimate insult.
The Japanese, who'd been on the winning side, get this slap at the peace conference. So the Japanese became alienated from the United States and from the Western powers, and it was a fairly straight line from there to the belief that if we're going to get any respect, it's going to be by fighting our way to respect.